Now, most people would probably think that the resurrection of Jesus is something you just believe in by faith or not. But over the last 50 years, there has been a remarkable transformation in historical Jesus scholarship, such that today the majority of New Testament historians have come to affirm three central facts about the events following Jesus' crucifixion, events which I believe are best explained by the fact of the resurrection of Jesus. What are these facts? Well, they are number one, Jesus' post-mortem appearances. Number two, the discovery of his empty tomb. And number three, the very origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. First, then, the post-mortem appearances of Jesus. Undoubtedly, the major impetus behind the reassessment of the historical credibility of the appearance traditions was the demonstration by the German scholar Joachim Jeremias that in his first letter to the church in Corinth, Greece, Paul is quoting from an old Christian tradition or saying which he himself had received and in turn passed on to his converts. In the 15th chapter of his first letter to the Corinthians, Paul says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received." And then comes this ancient oral tradition or saying that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, that's the Aramaic name for Peter, then to the 12. Now, according to Paul's letter to the churches of Galatia in chapter 1 and verse 18, Paul was in Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion on the Damascus Road on a fact-finding mission, during which time he conferred with both Peter, Jesus' chief disciple, and James, Jesus' younger brother, over a 2-week period of time. And he probably received this tradition at that time, if not before. Now, when you realize that Paul was converted in AD 33 and that Jesus was crucified around AD 30, that means that this list of witnesses to the post-mortem appearances of Jesus goes back to within the first 5 years after Jesus' death. And thus it is simply idle to try to dismiss these appearances as mere legends. According to John Dominic Crossan, a very skeptical, radical New Testament critic who believes that many of the events of the gospel passion narratives were invented on the basis of Old Testament motifs, it would take at least 5 to 10 years for the early church to find the Old Testament motifs to invent the passion story. And yet you notice that this information about the eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection appearances antedates even the lower limit set by Crossan of 5 years. Moreover, Crossan himself admits that it would be virtually impossible for the early church to have invented the resurrection narratives about Jesus after his death on the basis of Old Testament motifs, because there's virtually nothing in the Old Testament which would lead them to anticipate Jesus' resurrection from the dead. Thus, we can try to explain away these post-mortem appearances as hallucinatory experiences if we want to, but we cannot responsibly deny that they occurred. Paul's information makes it certain that on separate occasions, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus of Nazareth alive after his death. According to the German New Testament critic Gerhard Ludemann, it is historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. And this conclusion is today virtually universally accepted among New Testament historians. The physicality of Jesus' resurrection appearances is unanimously attested by all of our sources for these appearance narratives. Secondly, the discovery of Jesus' empty tomb. Once regarded as an offense to modern intelligence and even an embarrassment for the Christian faith, the empty tomb of Jesus has come to assume its place among the generally accepted facts concerning the historical Jesus. Let me just review briefly some of the evidence that undergirds this conclusion. Number one, the historical reliability of the burial narrative supports the empty tomb. Now you might ask, well, how is it that the reliability of the burial account of Jesus supports the historicity of his empty tomb? Well, very simply in the following way. If the burial account is accurate, then the site of Jesus' grave was known in Jerusalem to both Jew and Christian alike. But in that case, it's a very short inference to the historicity of the empty tomb. For if Jesus had not been raised from the dead, and the site of the grave were known, then in the first place, the disciples could never have believed in the resurrection of Jesus. For a first century Jew, the idea that a man might be raised from the dead while his corpse still lay in the tomb was simply a contradiction in terms. In the words of the New Testament commentator E. Ellis, it is very unlikely that the earliest Palestinian Christians could conceive of any distinction between resurrection and physical grave-emptying resurrection. To them, a resurrection without an empty grave, he says, would have been about as meaningful as a square circle. Secondly, even if the disciples had somehow managed to believe in the resurrection of Jesus, they wouldn't have generated any following in Jerusalem. So long as the corpse remained interred in the tomb, a Christian movement in Jerusalem founded on the belief in the resurrection of the dead man would have simply been an impossible folly. And thirdly, in any case, the Jewish authorities would have exposed the whole affair. The quickest and surest answer to the disciples' proclamation, "He is risen from the dead," would have been simply to point to his grave there in the hillside, or if necessary, even go to the extreme measure of exhuming the body and parading it through the streets of Jerusalem for all to see that Jesus of Nazareth had not in fact risen from the dead. So for these three reasons, the historical accuracy of the burial account supplies evidence for the historicity of the empty tomb. Unfortunately, for those who wish to deny the historicity of the empty tomb, however, the burial account of Jesus is recognized as one of the most historically reliable traditions that we have about Jesus of Nazareth. Most scholars are united in the judgment that Jesus of Nazareth was buried in a tomb by a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea late on Friday afternoon. According to John A.T. Robinson, the late New Testament scholar at Cambridge University, the burial of Jesus in the tomb is one of the earliest and best attested facts about Jesus. But if that is the case, then, as I've explained, the inference that the tomb was found empty is not very far at hand. Secondly, Paul's testimony supports the fact of the empty tomb. Here, I want to mention two aspects of Paul's testimony in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 that I quoted a moment ago. First, in the ancient formula or saying cited by Paul, the expression, "he was raised," following the expression, "he was buried," implies an empty tomb. A first century Jew could not have thought otherwise. As E.L. Bode observes in his very fine study of the empty tomb, the notion of the occurrence of a spiritual resurrection while the corpse still remained interred in the tomb is a peculiarity of modern theology. For the Jews, it was the remains of the man in the tomb that were raised, principally, in fact, the bones of the dead. And for that reason, Jewish funerary practices were to carefully preserve the bones of the deceased in ossuaries or bone boxes until the resurrection at the end of the world. I think there can be no doubt that both Paul and the early Christian formula that he cites presuppose the existence of the empty tomb in saying that Jesus was buried and he was raised. Second aspect of Paul's testimony that is noteworthy is the phrase, on the third day. He says Jesus was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. I think that this probably points to the discovery of the empty tomb. Now, very briefly summarized, the point is that since no one actually witnessed Jesus of Nazareth get up and walk out of the tomb, why did Christians come to date it on the third day? Why not on the 10th day or on the 7th day? Well, I think the most probable answer is that they did so because this was the day of the discovery of the empty tomb by Jesus' women followers. And therefore, the resurrection itself naturally came to be dated on the third day. And thus, in this extremely early oral tradition handed on by Paul, we have very early evidence for the existence of Jesus' empty tomb. Thirdly, the empty tomb story is part of the pre-Markan Passion story and is therefore very old. The empty tomb story was probably the end of Mark's Passion narrative, that is, the narrative of Jesus' suffering and death. Now, Mark didn't simply write this Passion narrative himself. Rather, most scholars believe that Mark had sources for the Passion story, which he employed in writing his gospel. Now, since Mark is already the earliest of the four gospels, that means that this Passion source goes even further back toward the events that it describes. In fact, according to the German commentator Rudolf Pesch, it is an incredibly early source. Pesch produces two lines of evidence in support of this conclusion. First, he notes that Paul's account of Jesus' Last Supper, which Paul hands on in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 to 25, presupposes the account in the Gospel of Mark. That is to say, the account of the Last Supper in the Gospel of Mark is even more primitive a tradition, even earlier a tradition than the one that Paul hands on in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Now, since we've already seen that Paul's traditions are incredibly ancient, that means that this Markan source must be even earlier. Secondly, Pesch notes that the pre-Markan Passion source never refers to the high priest by name. It's as if I were to say, the president is hosting a dinner at the White House, and everybody would know whom I was referring to, namely the man that is currently in office. Similarly, the pre-Markan Passion story never refers to Caiaphas by name, but simply calls him the high priest, as though he were still in power. Now, since Caiaphas held office from AD 18 to AD 37, that means at the very latest, this pre-Markan Passion source must come from within 7 years after Jesus' crucifixion. This source thus goes back to within the very first few years after Jesus' death and is therefore a very ancient and reliable source of historical information. Number 4, the story itself is simple and lacks any signs of legendary development. The empty tomb story, as we find it in Mark's gospel, is uncolored by theological or apologetical embellishments or motifs that would be characteristic of a later legendary account. Now, to give you an idea of what this account is like, let me simply read the account in the Gospel of Mark of the discovery of the empty tomb. Mark chapter 16, verses 1 to 8. Now, when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices that they might come and anoint him. Very early in the morning, on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb when the sun had risen. And they said among themselves, "Who will roll away the stone from the door of the tomb for us?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, for it was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in a long white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, as he said to you." So they went out quickly and fled from the tomb, for they trembled and were amazed, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Number 5, the tomb was probably discovered empty by women. Now, to appreciate this point, you need to understand two things about the role of women in first century Jewish society. First of all, women occupied a low rung on the Jewish social ladder. Secondly, the testimony of women was regarded as so worthless that according to Josephus, they were not even permitted to serve as legal witnesses in a Jewish court of law. How remarkable must it seem that it is women who are the discoverers of Jesus' empty tomb. Any later legendary account would certainly have made male disciples like Peter and John discover the empty tomb. The fact that it is women whose testimony was worthless rather than men who are the chief witnesses to the fact of Jesus' empty tomb is most plausibly explained by the fact that, like it or not, they were the discoverers of the empty tomb, and the Gospels accurately record what for them was a somewhat awkward and embarrassing fact. Number 6, the earliest Jewish polemic presupposes the empty tomb. In the 28th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, we find the Christian attempt to refute the earliest Jewish polemic against the disciples' proclamation of the resurrection. Now, what were Jews saying in response to the disciples' proclamation, "He is risen from the dead"? That his body still lay in the tomb? That these men were full of new wine? No, they were saying the disciples came and stole away his body. Now think about that for a minute. The disciples came and stole away his body. The earliest Jewish polemic did not deny the fact of the empty tomb, but rather embroiled itself in a hopeless dispute in trying to explain away why the body was missing. So that the earliest Jewish response to the proclamation of the resurrection was itself an attempt to explain why the tomb was empty. And thus we have evidence for the historicity of the empty tomb of Jesus, which is absolutely top drawer because it comes not from the Christian believers, but from the very opponents of the early Christian movement themselves. Now, I could go on, but I think probably enough has been said to indicate why, in the judgment of contemporary scholarship, the empty tomb of Jesus belongs to the historical portrait of Jesus of Nazareth. According to Jakob Kramer, who is an Austrian specialist in the resurrection, and I quote, "By far, most exegetes hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements concerning the empty tomb," end quote. So it is today widely recognized that the empty tomb of Jesus is a historical fact. As D.H. Van Dalen has pointed out, it is extremely difficult to object to the empty tomb on historical grounds. Those who deny it, he says, do so on the basis of theological or philosophical assumptions. But assumptions may simply have to be changed in light of the historical facts. Finally, we can turn to that third body of evidence supporting the resurrection, the very origin of the Christian movement itself. Even the most skeptical New Testament critics admit that the earliest disciples at least believed that God had raised Jesus of Nazareth from the dead. In fact, they pinned nearly everything on it. Without belief in Jesus' resurrection, Christianity could never have come into being. The crucifixion would have remained the final tragedy in the hapless life of the prophet from Nazareth. The origin of the Christian movement hinges upon the belief of these earliest disciples that Jesus had risen from the dead. Professor Mole asks, if the coming into existence of the Nazarenes, a phenomenon undeniably attested by the New Testament, rips a great hole in history, a hole the size and shape of the resurrection, what does the secular historian propose to stop it up with? The birth and rapid rise of the Christian church remain an unsolved enigma for any historian who refuses to take seriously the only explanation offered by the church itself. The mysterious X is still missing. So the question is, how then do you best explain these three independently attested facts? Taken together, these three great historical facts, the resurrection appearances, the discovery of the empty tomb, the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection, all seem to point to the historical fact of Jesus' resurrection as the most plausible explanation. But of course, there have been other explanations proffered to account for the resurrection appearances, empty tomb, and origin of the Christian faith down through history. But in the judgment of contemporary scholarship, none of these has succeeded in providing a plausible account of the facts of the case. And I think this can be seen by just a very rapid review of the principal explanations that have been offered. First, the so-called conspiracy theory. According to the conspiracy theory, the disciples stole Jesus' corpse and then lied about the resurrection appearances. This theory characterized the earliest Jewish anti-Christian polemic, as we've seen, and it was revived by the deists in the 18th century in England and then in Europe. Today, however, the theory has been universally rejected by critical scholars and survives only in sensational popular literature or in former propaganda from behind the Iron Curtain. To name just two considerations which were decisive against it, number one, it is morally impossible to indict the disciples of Jesus with such a crime. Whatever their imperfections, they were certainly good and earnest men and women and not imposters and hoaxers. No one who reads the New Testament unprejudicially can doubt that these people sincerely believed the truth of this message that they proclaimed and were willing to die for. But secondly, the theory is quite anachronistic. The conspiracy theory really cannot take seriously what a catastrophe the crucifixion was for any faith that the disciples had entertained in Jesus of Nazareth. It is guilty of looking at the crucifixion through the lenses of Christian history and belief in the resurrection rather than through the lenses of first century Palestinian Jews. Messianic movements were common in the centuries for and after Jesus, and the Romans always dealt with these messianic movements in the same way. They crucified the would-be Messiah. And when your favorite Messiah got crucified, you basically had two choices. Either you went home or you got yourself a new Messiah. But in no case do we have any movement saying that the crucified Messiah was in fact the Messiah after all, much less that God had raised him from the dead. This is simply unparalleled in Judaism. For Jewish messianic expectations, Messiah was supposed to restore the throne of David in Jerusalem and throw off the yoke of Israel's enemies, not be humiliatingly executed by them as a criminal. And the idea that Messiah was then to be raised from the dead was simply unknown in Judaism. Hence, to try to explain the empty tomb and resurrection appearances by some sort of a conspiracy theory simply seems out of the question. Secondly, the apparent death theory. According to this theory, Jesus did not really die on the cross, but he was taken down alive and placed in the tomb, where he revived and somehow escaped to convince the disciples that he had risen from the dead. This apparent death theory was championed by late 18th, early 19th century German rationalists, and unfortunately was even embraced by the father of modern theology, F.D.E. Schleiermacher. Today, however, the theory has been virtually entirely given up, and I think it's one of the virtues of Mel Gibson's movie that anyone who has seen that film and the suffering that Jesus of Nazareth endured would realize the patent absurdity of the apparent death theory. To name just a couple of points against it, number one, it would have been virtually medically impossible for Jesus to have survived the rigors of his torture and crucifixion, much less not to have died almost immediately of exposure when placed in the tomb. But secondly, the theory is explanatorily deficient in any case, since a half-dead Jesus, bleeding from open wounds and desperately in need of bandaging and medical attention, would hardly have elicited in the disciples the worship of him as the risen Lord and the conqueror of death. And these reasons alone, I think, make the apparent death theory untenable. A third theory was the hallucination theory. According to this theory, the disciples projected hallucinations of Jesus after his death, from which they mistakenly inferred his resurrection. The hallucination theory became popular during the 19th century and carried over into the first part of the 20th century as well. But again, there are good grounds for rejecting this hypothesis. First of all, it is psychologically implausible to posit such a chain of hallucinations. Hallucinations are usually associated with either mental illness or substance abuse. But in the disciples' case, the prior psychobiological preparation appears to be lacking. The disciples had no expectation of seeing Jesus alive again. All they could do would be wait until the resurrection at the end of the world to be reunited with him in the kingdom of God. There were no grounds leading them to hallucinate Jesus alive from the dead. And the frequency and the variety of the circumstances belie the hallucination theory. There is nothing in the case books of hallucinatory experiences in psychology parallel to the resurrection appearances. Jesus was not seen merely once, but many times, not just by one person, but by many persons, not just by individuals, but by groups of people, not just at one locale and under one circumstance, but at many different locales and under a variety of circumstances, not by believers only, but also by skeptics, unbelievers, and even enemies. The hallucination hypothesis simply can't be stretched to accommodate this kind of diversity. Secondly, hallucinations, if they had occurred, would not have, in any case, led to belief in Jesus' resurrection. You see, as projections of your own mind, hallucinations cannot contain anything that is not already in your mind. But we've seen that the Jewish conception of resurrection from the dead differed from Jesus' resurrection in two fundamental respects. Given their typical Jewish frame of thought, the disciples, were they to hallucinate visions of Jesus, would have projected visions of Jesus glorified in Abraham's bosom, in paradise, where the Jews believed the righteous dead went to await the resurrection at the end of the world. And thus hallucinations would not have elicited belief in Jesus' resurrection, which ran solidly contrary to modes of Jewish thinking, but at most would have led to belief that Jesus had been assumed or translated into heaven, whence he appeared to them, on the model of certain Old Testament figures like Enoch and Elijah. And thus the hallucination hypothesis is simply explanatorily inadequate when it comes to the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection from the dead. Finally, number three, nor can hallucinations account for the explanation of all of the evidence. They're offered as an explanation of the post-mortem appearances of Jesus. But you see, they leave the empty tomb of Jesus unexplained, and therefore they fail as a complete and satisfactory answer. In order to explain the full range of the evidence, you have to conjoin to the hallucination hypothesis an independent hypothesis in order to explain away the empty tomb. By contrast, the resurrection hypothesis has a broader explanatory scope and is therefore a preferable explanation. Thus, none of the previous counter-explanations have succeeded in explaining the evidence as plausibly as the resurrection hypothesis itself. Now, this puts the skeptical critic in a somewhat desperate situation. You might say to me then, well, what do skeptical scholars say to explain the resurrection appearances, the empty tomb, and the origin of the Christian faith? Well, as a matter of fact, they don't say anything. Modern scholarship recognizes no plausible, naturalistic explanation of these three facts. Those who refuse to accept the resurrection as a fact of history are simply self-confessedly left with no explanation at all. So in conclusion then, these three independently established facts, the post-mortem appearances of Jesus, the discovery of his empty tomb, the very origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection, all seem to point unavoidably to one marvelous conclusion, that God raised Jesus of Nazareth from the dead. Today, I think the rational man can hardly be blamed if he believes that on that first Easter morning, a divine miracle has occurred.